The Texas sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless sky, beating down on Abigail Turner's small homestead. 3 months since Thomas's death, and the drought had only worsened. At 32, she had already buried a husband and infant son, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses that cast slender shadows in the evening light. Abigail wiped her brow, leaving a streak of dirt across her sunburned forehead. The well was nearly dry, offering only enough water for another week. Her neighbors had already abandoned their homesteads, but Abigail couldn't leave. This land held everything she had left: Thomas's dreams, her baby's remains, and her dwindling hope. She had just set down her shovel when a sound caught her attention. A low groan, human and pained. Abigail froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that leaned against the half-finished well. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite her quickening pulse. When no answer came, she moved cautiously toward the sound. Beyond her property line, where cultivated land surrendered to wild prairie, she saw him. A man lay face down in the dirt, one arm outstretched toward her homestead as if he had been crawling before his strength failed. Even from a distance, Abigail recognized the long black hair, the deerskin leggings. Comanche. Her grip on the rifle tightened. Stories of raids, of settlers murdered, of women taken captive, all flashed through her mind. But the man wasn't moving. A dark stain had spread across his side, and as Abigail drew closer, she could see it was blood from what appeared to be a gunshot wound. "He's dying," she murmured. Part of her, shaped by fear and frontier warnings, told her to turn back. The Comanche were enemies of the settlers. Everyone knew that. But another voice, one that sounded like Thomas's, reminded her, "A life is a life, Abby. God sees no difference in the value of souls based on the color of skin." Cautiously, keeping the rifle ready, Abigail knelt beside the wounded man. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his copper skin hot with fever. He couldn't have been much older than 30, his face marked with ceremonial scars and a single eagle feather tied in his hair. His eyes opened suddenly, dark, intense eyes that fixed on Abigail with pain and defiance. He tensed, his hand moving reflexively to his waist where a knife should have been, but finding nothing. "I'm not going to hurt you," Abigail said, hoping her tone would convey her meaning. "You're wounded. Let me help." The Comanche warrior stared at her for a long moment. Then, whether from pain or a decision to trust, his eyes closed again. Abigail managed to half-drag the man to the shade of her porch. Inside her cabin, she gathered what few medical supplies she had: clean rags, a needle and thread, a small bottle of whiskey. She hesitated at her water barrel, now barely a quarter full. Every drop was precious, but the man would die without water. With a deep breath, Abigail filled her last clean cup and returned to the porch. The warrior's eyes followed her movements as she knelt beside him again. "You need to drink," she said, lifting his head gently. For a moment he resisted, then thirst overcame caution, and he drank deeply. When the cup was empty, Abigail began tending his wounds. She cut away the blood-soaked fabric around the bullet hole, wincing at the angry flesh beneath. "This will hurt," she warned, pouring whiskey over the wound. The warrior's body went rigid, a hiss escaping through clenched teeth, but he made no move to stop her as she cleaned the injury. The bullet had passed through, which was a blessing. With trembling fingers, Abigail threaded her needle and began to stitch the wound closed, working by instinct and half-remembered lessons from her mother. Throughout the procedure, the Comanche warrior remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on Abigail's face. Only the occasional sharp intake of breath betrayed his suffering. As dusk fell, Abigail finished her work, binding the wound with strips of clean cloth. The warrior's fever still burned, but his breathing had steadied. Whether he would live through the night remained to be seen. Abigail brought her bedroll out to the porch. She couldn't possibly move him inside alone, and she was unwilling to leave him unattended. As the first stars appeared, she settled a few feet from her unexpected patient, the rifle within easy reach. "I don't know if you can understand anything I'm saying," she said softly. "But my name is Abigail. Abigail Turner." The Comanche's gaze met hers one last time before sleep claimed him. In that brief moment, something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but a recognition. Two souls alone in an unforgiving land, connected by nothing more than humanity's most basic instinct, survival. Dawn broke with soft golden light. Abigail awoke with a start, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle before she remembered. But the porch beside her was empty, save for the blood-stained blanket. A movement near the well caught her eye. There, silhouetted against the rising sun, stood the warrior. He was upright, though leaning heavily on a makeshift staff, his free hand pressed against his bandaged side. Before she could decide whether to reach for her weapon, the Comanche turned, sensing her presence. Their eyes met across the distance, and Abigail was struck by the clarity in his gaze. The fever had broken. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or thanks, then began to make his way slowly toward the eastern horizon. "Wait!" Abigail called, hurrying down the porch steps. "You shouldn't be walking. Your wound—" The warrior paused but did not turn back. When Abigail reached him, she could see the determination in his face, the pride that kept him standing despite the obvious agony each movement caused. "You'll tear your stitches," she said, gesturing to his side where a small spot of fresh blood had seeped through the bandages. "At least let me check the wound before you go." For a long moment, the Comanche regarded her silently. Then, with a slight nod, he allowed her to lead him back to the porch. He sat with his back straight, dignity evident in every line of his body as Abigail unwrapped the bandages. The wound looked better than she had dared hope, red and angry still, but clean. As she applied fresh bandages, the warrior watched her hands with careful attention. When she was done, the Comanche reached slowly into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something, holding it out to her in his open palm. A necklace, simple but beautiful, made of carved bone beads and a single turquoise stone. "I can't take that," Abigail said, shaking her head. "I don't need payment." The warrior continued to hold out the necklace, his expression making it clear this was not a transaction but something else. A gesture that transcended their inability to communicate with words. Hesitantly, Abigail accepted the gift. "Thank you," she said softly. The Comanche rose to his feet and spoke for the first time, a single word in his language that Abigail couldn't understand, but somehow knew was his name. "Taabe," he said, placing his hand over his heart. "Taabe," Abigail repeated. Then, mimicking his gesture, she touched her own chest. "Abigail." "Abigail," he echoed, the syllables careful on his tongue. With one last look, a look that contained something like a promise, Taabe turned and began his journey eastward. She watched until his figure became a distant silhouette, wondering if she would ever know what circumstances had brought a wounded Comanche warrior to her land. As the weeks passed, Abigail's life returned to its rhythm of survival. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, she would touch the bone necklace she now wore beneath her dress and think of dark eyes that had regarded her with dignity and gratitude. It was early October when Abigail rode to the small settlement of Cottonwood Creek to trade for winter supplies. The mood there was tense. "You shouldn't be living out there alone, Mrs. Turner," Mr. Holloway, the general store owner, told her. "Not with what's been happening." "What do you mean?" Abigail asked, unease fluttering in her stomach. "New settlers from the east, not honest folk, but men with hard eyes and quick tempers. They've been claiming abandoned homesteads, sometimes not waiting for them to be properly abandoned." He lowered his voice. "Matheson's place was burned to the ground last week. He was found with a bullet in his back." "That's terrible," Abigail whispered. "Sheriff can't do much when he doesn't know who's responsible," Holloway continued. "But word is these men have connections with the railroad companies. They're buying up land cheap or taking it by force." Abigail's homestead, while struggling, was well positioned near a natural pass through the hills, a likely route for any future railroad. "I can't leave," she said firmly. "That land is all I have left." The journey home was tense. By the time her cabin came into view, the sun was setting. Something felt wrong. The door stood open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Abigail was certain she had closed it before leaving. Heart pounding, she approached cautiously, reaching for the small pistol in her saddlebag. The interior of her cabin had been ransacked, furniture overturned, her few possessions scattered across the floor. This was a warning. Nothing of value had been taken, but someone had deliberately destroyed what they could, sending a message more effective than words. Leave, or next time will be worse. That night, Abigail slept fitfully, the pistol beneath her pillow offering little comfort. Morning brought no clarity, only the harsh reality of the mess she needed to clean. She was gathering broken pieces of her mother's china when a shadow fell across the doorway. She whirled, pistol raised, only to freeze in disbelief. Taabe stood in her doorway, his tall figure blocking the sunlight. He looked different, stronger, his bearing proud and confident. His eyes took in the destruction, then met hers with a question. "They came yesterday, while I was away?" Abigail explained, though she knew he probably couldn't understand. "Men who want my land." Taabe stepped inside, surveying the damage. His expression darkened, and when he looked at Abigail again, she saw something fierce in his gaze. A controlled anger that made her understand why the Comanche were so feared. He spoke, a stream of words in his language that Abigail couldn't comprehend. But his meaning became clear when he gestured first to her, then to the homestead, and finally placed his hand over his heart. "You want to help me?" she asked, hardly daring to believe. Taabe nodded once, decisively. Then, to Abigail's surprise, he spoke in broken, heavily accented English. "You give water. Save Taabe." He touched the scar on his side, then gestured to her and the damaged cabin. "Now Taabe protect." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes. This man, this supposed enemy, had returned to repay a debt of honor she had never thought to collect. As the day progressed, Abigail learned that Taabe had not come alone. 2 other Comanche warriors waited at the edge of her property, mounted on paint horses. They kept their distance, watching silently as Taabe helped Abigail repair what had been broken. They spoke little, but in the silence between them grew a different kind of understanding, a mutual respect forged through shared purpose. By sunset, the cabin was restored to order. As darkness fell, Taabe and his companions made camp a short distance from the cabin, close enough to keep watch. That night, for the first time in months, Abigail slept without fear. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. The men came at dawn, 5 of them on horseback, dust billowing behind them. Abigail saw them from her garden and turned toward the cabin to retrieve her rifle. But before she could take more than a few steps, Taabe moved to position himself between her and the approaching riders. His 2 companions materialized from elsewhere on the property, arrows knocked in their bows. For 3 days, the Comanche had maintained their vigil. They kept their distance when Abigail worked, but she would sometimes look up to find Taabe's dark eyes on her, attentive and unreadable. At night, she would leave food on the porch that always disappeared. In return, she would occasionally find a rabbit or prairie hen, cleaned and ready for cooking, left in the same spot. The riders were led by Jacob Byrne, who owned a saloon in Cottonwood Creek and was rumored to have connections with the railroad men. Beside him rode his son, Wesley, and 3 others Abigail didn't recognize, hard-faced men with pistols at their hips. "Get inside," Taabe said to her, his English still halting but improved. When Abigail hesitated, he added firmly, "Please." She nodded, retreating to the porch where she could still see and hear but would be partially sheltered. Her hands trembled as she reached for her rifle. The riders pulled up 20 yards from where Taabe and his companions stood. For a long moment, silence stretched between the 2 groups, surprise evident in the settlers' postures. Jacob Byrne recovered first, his weathered face contorting into a sneer. "Well, well, Mrs. Turner," he called. "I didn't realize you'd taken to keeping pet savages. Does the Army know you're harboring hostiles?" "These men are my guests, Mr. Byrne," Abigail replied, stepping forward despite Taabe's warning. What brings you to my property? Burns' gaze flicked from Abigail to the Comanche and back. Just being neighborly, ma'am. Heard you had some trouble here recently. Thought I'd come by and make you an offer. Take this failing piece of land off your hands before anything worse happens. This land isn't for sale, Abigail said firmly. And I don't recall inviting you onto it. Wesley Byrne, a younger version of his father with the same red hair, spat into the dust. Don't need an invitation when dealing with Indian lovers. Jacob silenced his son with a sharp look, then returned his attention to Abigail, a false smile spreading beneath his mustache. Mrs. Turner, be reasonable. A woman alone can't hope to work this land properly. I'm offering you fair compensation and safe passage to wherever you'd like to go. I've managed so far, Abigail replied coldly, and as you can see, I'm not alone. Something ugly flashed across Byron's face. Those savages won't protect you forever. They'll either be hunted down by the army or crawl back to their tribe. And then where will you be? Taabe took a step forward. Though he carried no visible weapon, his presence seemed to fill the space between the two groups, commanding and dangerous. He spoke in Comanche, and his companions immediately adjusted their positions, spreading out to flank the riders. Have it your way for now, Byrne said finally, gathering his reins. But think on my offer. It won't remain open indefinitely. Land that can't be bought can always be taken. With that thinly veiled threat hanging in the air, Byrne wheeled his horse around. His companions followed, though Wesley lingered a moment longer, his young face twisted with malice. This isn't over, he called over his shoulder. Not by a long shot. When the dust of their departure had settled, Abigail let out a shaky breath. Taabe approached her slowly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Dangerous men, he said, the words carefully chosen. Yes, Abigail agreed. They won't give up easily. The railroad is coming through these parts, and my land... She broke off, realizing the complexity was beyond their shared language. Instead, she simply said, They want what isn't theirs to take. Taabe nodded, understanding this fundamental truth that transcended culture. He gestured toward the house, then to himself and his companions. We stay. Watch. Gratitude welled up in Abigail's chest, along with something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with the man standing before her, proud and steadfast in his commitment. Thank you, she said softly. Then, hesitating only briefly, she added, But I can't ask you to risk yourselves for me. Those men have connections. If the army gets involved... Taabe's expression hardened, not in anger but in resolve. He touched his side where the bullet wound had healed. You give life, he said simply. Honor demands. That evening, as twilight painted the Texas sky in deepening shades of purple and gold, Abigail sat on her porch steps, watching as Taabe skinned a rabbit for their meal. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the blade of his knife glinting in the fading light. In the silence between them, Abigail found herself studying him openly. The strong line of his jaw, the careful concentration in his dark eyes, the way the last light caught in his long black hair. He was as different from Thomas as a man could be. Where her husband had been fair and bookish, a dreamer, Taabe was all earth and present moment, rooted in reality. Yet in their differences, Abigail found something unexpectedly familiar, a steadfastness, a quiet integrity that reminded her of what she had loved most in Thomas. May I ask you something? She said, breaking the comfortable silence. Taabe looked up from his work, his hands stilling. He nodded once. That day I found you? What happened? Who shot you? For a moment she thought he might not answer. But then he set aside the rabbit and knife, wiping his hands before sitting beside her on the steps. Hunters, he said, the word laden with meaning. White men. Hunt for... He paused, searching for words, then made a circular motion around his head. Scalps, Abigail whispered, horror dawning as she realized what he was describing. Bounty hunters who collected Comanche scalps for payment. Taabe nodded grimly. 3 men. I kill 1. Others shoot. He touched his side, then gestured to indicate fleeing. "I run. Many days. No water. Then—" His gaze met hers, intense and direct. Then Abigail. The way he said her name, careful and deliberate, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. In that moment, the vast gulf between their worlds seemed both unbridgeable and irrelevant. "I'm glad you found your way here," Abigail said softly, surprising herself with the depth of feeling behind the simple words. Taabe held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with careful movements, he reached for her hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, warm against her skin as he turned her palm upward and placed something in it, a small carving made from antler, shaped into the form of a bird in flight. "For strength," he said, closing her fingers gently around the gift. That night, as a pale moon rose over the Texas prairie, Abigail lay awake, the small carving clutched in her hand. Outside, she knew Taabe kept watch, a sentinel between her and danger. In the quiet darkness, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth, that what had begun as an act of mercy had become something neither had sought but both now faced, a connection that defied the hatred dividing their peoples. It was a dangerous feeling, as perilous as the men who coveted her land. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, Abigail found she could no longer imagine a future that didn't include the quiet presence of the man who had returned to honor a debt with his protection, and perhaps with his heart. The first snow of winter fell 3 weeks later, delicate flakes drifting from a pewter sky. Abigail stood at her window, watching as the familiar contours of her property transformed beneath the gentle onslaught. Much had changed since Burns' visit. Taabe's companions had departed days ago, returning to their people before winter made travel difficult, but Taabe himself had remained. He had built a small shelter at the edge of Abigail's property, close enough to keep watch but distant enough to maintain propriety. They had settled into an unexpected rhythm, their days filled with preparing for winter, smoking meat, sealing drafts in the cabin walls, gathering firewood. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes engaged in the slow work of building a bridge between their languages. Taabe spoke little of his past, but occasionally Abigail would glimpse the weight of loss he carried. Family members taken by disease, brought by white settlers, hunting grounds diminished, a way of life under threat of extinction. It should have been impossible, this tentative peace between them. Everything in their respective worlds insisted they were enemies, separated by a chasm of blood and history too wide to cross. Yet each day, that chasm seemed to narrow, bridged by small moments of shared understanding. The sound of approaching horses pulled Abigail from her reverie. Through the swirling snow, she could make out 3 riders moving steadily toward her cabin. Her pulse quickened until she recognized Sheriff Dawson's tall figure leading the group. "Taabe," she called, moving quickly to the door. He appeared from around the side of the cabin where he had been splitting wood, his expression alert. "It's the sheriff," Abigail explained. Sheriff Dawson was a fair man by most accounts, but his jurisdiction included enforcing increasingly restrictive laws regarding Native Americans. "I should go," Taabe said, his English now fluid enough to express complex thoughts. "If they see me—" "No," Abigail said firmly, reaching for his arm. "You've done nothing wrong. This is my land and you're here at my invitation." She took a deep breath. "Besides, running would only make you look guilty of something." Taabe hesitated, conflict evident in his features. Then, with a slight nod, he positioned himself slightly behind Abigail on the porch as Sheriff Dawson and his deputies dismounted. "Morning, Mrs. Turner," the sheriff called, removing his hat. Snow collected on his graying mustache and the shoulders of his heavy coat. His eyes moved past her to Taabe, narrowing slightly but betraying no immediate hostility. "I see the rumors are true." "Good morning, Sheriff," Abigail replied steadily. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Complaints, Mrs. Turner. Jacob Burns seems to think you're harboring hostile Comanche. Says they threatened him when he came to make you a business proposition." "Mr. Byrne came uninvited onto my property and implied that if I didn't sell my land to him, I might meet with an unfortunate accident, Abigail said coldly. Taabe and his friends were guests here. They made no threats, though they did make it clear I wasn't alone and unprotected. Dawson's gaze shifted to Taabe. That true, fella? You speak English? It is true, Taabe answered, his accent more pronounced under scrutiny, but his words clear. Byrne men come with threats. We protect what is Abigail's. One of the deputies, a young man with a patchy beard, snorted. Since when do Comanche care about protecting white women's property? Since this woman saved my life, Taabe replied with dignity. I owe debt of honor. Byrne men are jackals who hunt a lone woman. This is not honorable. Sheriff Dawson studied Taabe thoughtfully, then turned back to Abigail. Mrs. Turner, I respect your right to choose your own company, but having him here is causing talk. Not everyone in Cottonwood Creek is as open-minded as you might hope. I'm well aware of that, Sheriff, Abigail said, but I won't be intimidated off my land, and I won't turn away someone who's done nothing but help me. Dawson sighed. Fair enough, but I should warn you, Byrne's been talking to Captain Reynolds over at Fort Davis, claiming there's Comanche raiders in the area, stirring up trouble for honest settlers. He glanced meaningfully at Taabe. Army might not be as inclined to listen to your side of things as I am. The implication was clear. Taabe's presence put him in danger, and by extension, Abigail as well. Thank you for the warning, she said quietly. Is there anything else? Dawson shook his head. Just be careful, Mrs. Turner. World's complicated enough without... He paused, gesturing vaguely between her and Taabe, without making it more so. After the sheriff and his deputies had ridden away, Abigail turned to Taabe. The worry she had suppressed now surfaced, tightening her throat. Perhaps you should go back to your people, she said reluctantly. At least until spring. If the army comes looking... No. Taabe's response was immediate and firm. He stepped closer, close enough that Abigail could see snowflakes catching in his eyelashes. I do not leave you to face Byrne alone. But if they capture you... The thought was too terrible to complete. Taabe's expression softened, and with gentleness that belied his warrior's strength, he reached out to touch her cheek, brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Something's worth risk, Abigail. The way he said her name, no longer broken into careful syllables but flowing naturally from his lips, made something shift inside her. Without thinking, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me, she whispered. And I could not live with honor if I abandoned woman who gave last water to dying enemy. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. What is between us now is more than debt. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile as the snowflakes that continued to fall. Abigail opened her eyes to find Taabe watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. A look that asked a question neither of them had dared voice until now. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, breath mingling in the cold air. Then, with the same deliberate care, Taabe pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning rather than demanding, but it ignited something within Abigail that she had thought died with Thomas, a hunger for connection. Her hands moved to Taabe's shoulders, fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt as she returned the kiss with equal tenderness. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, the world around them seemed transformed, not just by the snow, but by the acknowledgement of what had been growing between them since that first fateful day. The Comanche have a saying, Taabe said softly, his arms still around her waist. Water brings life to all things, even to hope long buried in dry earth. Abigail smiled, understanding the poetry of his words, how her last cup of water had not only saved his life, but had, in some mysterious way, restored her own. 2 days later, as twilight gathered, Taabe returned from hunting with news that chilled Abigail more thoroughly than the winter cold. Soldiers, he said as he entered the cabin, his expression grave. "Camped 5 miles south. Many men. Moving this way." Abigail's hands stilled in the act of kneading bread dough. "How many?" 20, maybe more, with Byrne as guide." Taabe moved to the window, peering out at the darkening sky. "They come tomorrow, I think." Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. "They're coming for you?" Taabe nodded, his profile sharp against the fading light. "And for your land." That night, as a nearly full moon rose over the snow-covered plains, they came together not in desperation, but in a deliberate affirmation of the bond formed between them. In Taabe's arms, Abigail found a tenderness that transcended words, a connection that defied the boundaries their worlds had established. Later, as they lay entwined beneath warm blankets, Taabe spoke of his childhood, of summers spent learning to track and hunt, of winters gathered around fires listening to elders' stories. Abigail shared memories of Virginia, of the family she had left to follow Thomas West, of the dreams they had nurtured for their future on this harsh but beautiful land. "If we survive tomorrow," she whispered against his chest, "what becomes of us?" Taabe was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "My people have place," he said finally. "Far mountains to west. Army not go there. Land good for small farm horses." He propped himself up, looking down at her with solemn intensity. "We could go. Make new life." The offer took Abigail's breath away, a future neither could have imagined when she had first offered water to a dying stranger. "Yes," she said, her heart swelling with hope. "If we survive tomorrow, we'll go together." Dawn brought a sky clear and cold. Abigail and Taabe prepared methodically, gathering supplies, readying the horses for a swift departure if opportunity allowed. By mid-morning, they could see dust rising on the southern horizon, the approaching soldiers. Captain Reynolds arrived at the head of 15 soldiers, with Jacob and Wesley Byrne riding alongside. They formed a semicircle in Abigail's yard, their presence incongruous against the peaceful backdrop of the snow-covered homestead. "Mrs. Turner," Reynolds called, a man in his 40s with a weathered face and cold eyes. "I'm here on official business. We have reports of hostile Comanche in the area, possibly being harbored on this property." Abigail stepped forward, her chin raised. "There are no hostiles here, Captain. Only a friend who has been helping me prepare for winter." "A friend," she calls him, Wesley Byrne sneered. "Tell that to the settlers he's probably scalped." "That's enough, boy," Reynolds said sharply, then turned back to Abigail. "Mrs. Turner, harboring unauthorized Indians off reservation land is a violation of territorial law. I'm going to have to ask you to turn over any natives on your property immediately." "And if I refuse?" Reynolds's expression hardened. "Then we will be forced to search these premises and apprehend them ourselves." The moment stretched taut with tension. Abigail was acutely aware of Taabe somewhere behind her, watching, waiting. She thought of the life they had imagined together, of mountains to the west, and a future built on something other than fear and hatred. "There is one Comanche here," she said finally, her voice steady. "He saved my life when men like Mr. Byrne threatened to take my land by force. He has committed no crime except to protect a woman alone." Before she could continue, a movement at the edge of the yard caught everyone's attention. Taabe stepped into view, unarmed, his bearing proud as he approached. Abigail's heart constricted. His decision to reveal himself rather than flee spoke volumes about the man he was. "I am here," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "This woman has done nothing wrong. If you must take someone, take me." Reynolds nodded to two of his men who moved forward to seize Taabe. Abigail stepped between them, her eyes blazing. "If you take him, you take me as well," she declared. "And I will ensure every newspaper from here to Washington hears how the U.S. Army arrested a widow for the crime of being helped by someone whose skin is darker than her own." A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. Public sentiment regarding the treatment of natives was shifting, if slowly. A story like this, especially involving a respectable white woman, could cause uncomfortable questions. The captain frowned, weighing his options. It was Jacob Byrne who broke the silence, his face mottled with anger. "This is absurd," he spat. "The woman's clearly lost her mind. The land should be seized and she should be sent back east where she belongs." "That's not your decision to make, Byrne," Reynolds replied coolly. "Then whose decision is it?" a new voice asked. All heads turned to see Sheriff Dawson riding into the yard, accompanied by 3 deputies and, surprisingly, several townspeople from Cottonwood Creek. "Sheriff," Reynolds acknowledged with a curt nod, "this is a military matter." "Is it?" Dawson dismounted. "Seems to me this is about a woman's right to decide who she allows on her legally owned property." He approached Abigail, tipping his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Turner, these folks have come to speak on your behalf." Confused but hopeful, Abigail nodded. Mr. Holloway stepped forward, his usually mild face determined. "Captain, I've known Jacob Byrne for 15 years, and in that time, I've never known him to let honesty stand in the way of profit. He's been boasting in my store about how he'll have the Turner land before winter's end. One way or another, others from town added their voices, sharing stories of Byrne's threats against other smallholders, of mysterious fires and accidents that befell those who refused to sell to him. As for the Comanche," Dawson added, "I've had no reports of raids in this area for months. The only complaints I've received have been from Byrne about Mrs. Turner's choice of company." He looked pointedly at Taabe. "And as far as I can tell, that's her business, not ours." Reynolds, looking increasingly uncomfortable, glanced between the townsfolk, the Byrnes, and Abigail and Taabe, who now stood side by side. "Captain," Abigail said, seizing the moment, "I believe you're an honorable man. You were told there were hostile Comanche threatening settlers, but what you've found is one man helping a widow survive the winter. Is that worth the stain on your conscience?" Something shifted in Reynolds's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of the humanity standing before him rather than the savage he had been conditioned to see. "Mr. Byrne," he said coldly, "it seems you've misrepresented the situation. I don't take kindly to being used as a tool in land disputes." He turned to his men. "We're returning to Fort Davis. There are no hostiles here requiring our attention." Jacob Byrne's face contorted with rage. "You can't be serious. That Indian—" "Has more honor than you, from what I can see," Reynolds interrupted. "Sheriff, I suggest you keep an eye on the Byrnes. I'd hate to hear of any further trouble befalling Mrs. Turner." As the soldiers began to withdraw, Wesley Byrne made a sudden, desperate move, drawing his pistol and aiming at Taabe. "If you won't do what needs doing, I will." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Abigail saw the gun, saw Taabe tensing beside her. Without thinking, she stepped forward, placing herself between the weapon and the man she loved. "No!" Multiple voices shouted at once. A shot rang out. But it was Wesley who fell, clutching his arm where one of the deputies had shot him, the deputy's reaction quicker than Wesley's finger on the trigger. Jacob Byrne rushed to his son, face pale with shock. "You'll all pay for this," he snarled, but his threat sounded hollow now. In the aftermath, as the Byrnes were taken into custody and the soldiers departed, Sheriff Dawson approached Abigail and Taabe, who stood amid the churned snow of the yard. "You two all right?" he asked, genuine concern in his weather-beaten face. Abigail nodded, her hand finding Taabe's and holding tight. "Yes, thank you, Sheriff. And everyone," she added, looking at the townspeople. "I never expected—" "Well," Holloway said with a small smile, "we may be slow to change out here, but we know right from wrong. Byrne's been a thorn in everyone's side for too long." Dawson's gaze moved to Abigail and Taabe's clasped hands, then to the silver ring glinting on her finger that Taabe had given her the night before, a simple band etched with flowing lines that reminded her of water moving over stone. "Life's too short and too hard out here to judge how folks find happiness," he said quietly. "But you should know, not everyone will be as accepting as these good people." He glanced at Taabe. "The reservation's not a good place for your people. That's God's truth. But this territory isn't always kind to those who walk between worlds either. Taabe met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "We know," he said. "We go west. New beginning." Dawson nodded slowly. "The mountains, eh? Good country out there. I wish you both well." As their unexpected allies departed, leaving Abigail and Taabe standing alone in the yard, the last light of day gilded the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. The world stretched before them, vast and uncertain but suddenly rich with possibility. Abigail turned to Taabe, framing his face between her hands. "I thought I'd lost everything," she whispered. "When Thomas died, when the drought came, I thought this land would be my grave." Taabe covered her hands with his own, his dark eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "Instead, it became place of beginning," he said, "where enemy became protector, where loneliness became love, where the last drop of water brought life to something beautiful," Abigail added, remembering his words. As twilight deepened around them, Abigail and Taabe stood together on the threshold of a future neither could have imagined. A future they would forge not as widow and warrior, settler and Comanche, but as a man and woman who had found in each other the courage to defy a divided world. The journey ahead would not be easy. The mountains were distant, the path uncertain, the prejudices of both their peoples deep-rooted. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening Texas sky, Abigail knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together, strengthened by a bond forged in survival and tempered by a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely soil. For in a land where water was life itself, they had given each other the most precious gift of all, the chance to begin again, like seeds long dormant, awakening at the touch of rain, reaching toward the light of a new dawn. Thank you for listening to this deeply moving Wild West love story. If it resonated with you, we warmly invite you to like, comment, and share this video. Your support truly means the world to us and gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more stories of love, redemption, and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you're the first to hear each new release. With every like and comment, you help this community grow. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another story from our channel. Click and be surprised by yet another emotional tale that just might steal your heart.